Good morning. Sri Thawar Chand Gehlot, Minister Social Justice and Empowerment, Dr. Najma Heptullah, Minister Minority Affairs, Sri Sudarshan Bhagat, Minister of State, Social Justice and Empowerment, Justice S.S. Charaya, Chairman, National Commission for Backward Classes, Sri Sivanna, Chairman, National Commission of Safai Karmachari, Sri Sudhir Bhargav, Secretary, Social Justice, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. At the very outset, I would like to express my deep appreciations and gratitude to Dr. Ambedkar Foundation and the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment for inviting me to deliver the 5th memorial lecture on Dr. Ambedkar, the maker and architect of India's Constitution. Dr. Babasaheb Bhimrao Ambedkar was an outstanding leader and of our freedom struggle and a staunch crusader for the rights of the downtrodden and backward sections of our society. Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar received Bharat Ratnam. He was a great scholar, journalist, educationist, legal luminary, social reform, over and above, a crusader for justice. He was the principal architect of the Indian Constitution and shall always be remembered for his role of painstakingly drafting our founding document. Dr. Ambedkar's philosophy and life are a profile of courage and conviction. He dedicated himself to the pursuit of knowledge, overcoming many adversities on account of his caste and poor economic background. He graduated from Elphinstone College in Mumbai and thereafter was awarded a scholarship to attend Columbia University in New York, and where he obtained his doctorate degree. Then he moved to United Kingdom in 1916, where he studied in London School of Economics and was also subsequently obtained the law degree from Gray's Inn and became the barrister at law. After his return to India, Dr. Ambedkar became the voice of the depressed classes and started many organizations to promote their cause. Dr. Ambedkar's contribution to India's legal and constitutional development and also economic development is not confined merely to the drafting of the Constitution. Long before that, he took some initiatives which had very far-reaching impact on our institutional lives. Dr. Ambedkar's legacy and contribution to India can be seen in many fields. His PhD thesis of 1923, titled The Evolution of the Provincial Finance in British India, provided academic basis for the constitution of the Finance Commission, which was later on reflected in Article 280 of the Constitution when it was finally adopted. Similarly, the very existence of the Reserve Bank of India was first conceptualized by Dr. Ambedkar when he helped the Royal Commission of India, Currency and Finance in 1925 through his book, The Problem of Rupee, Its Problems and Solution, It was an invaluable reference tool for the Central Legislative Assembly in those days to enact the Reserve Bank of India Act 1934. Even as executive, as Labour member in the Viceroy's Executive Council, it was Dr. Ambedkar's persistent efforts which reduced the working hour of the labour from 12 hours to 8 hours. He contributed to setting up the institution of employment exchange. He was almost single-handedly responsible for establishing the Central Technical Power Board, National Power Grid System, and the Central Water Irrigation and Navigation Commission, and also in the initial days for establishing the major multipurpose power and irrigation projects like Damodar Valley Corporation on the model of Tennessee Valley Corporation of USA was initiated by Dr. Ambedkar. He was a vociferous reader, and he recognized that education is a tool for the liberation of the socially backward from illiteracy, ignorance, and superstition. He founded the People's Education Society in 1945 with the aim of advancing the educational interests of the weaker sections of society. Dr. Ambedkar was also a crusader for gender equity and fought for equal rights for women in inheritance and marriage. He resigned from the cabinet in 1951 when his draft Hindu Code Bill failed to receive the support of the Parliament. He was not always guided by the whims of the majority. He was always guided by the reason, logic, and conviction. Undoubtedly, his singular and most significant contribution was as the chairman of the drafting committee of the Constitution of India. With tremendous foresight and erudite scholarships, Dr. Ambedkar not only piloted an outstanding draft through the Constituent Assembly, but also outlined the philosophy and wisdom behind its various provisions. That is the reason why this Constitution, even by its very bitter critic at the initial stage, was highly complimented. For example, through the comments of Sir Anthony Eden, the Prime Minister of UK in the mid-50s, when Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was talking of the Constitution and propagating it, he wrote him that you are suffering from an illusion and very soon you will recognize that your experiment with all the constitutional provisions which you have incorporated would not fructify. But after the successful completion of the second general election, it is Sir Anthony Eden who described Indian Constitution not merely as an instrument to govern, but the most important Magna Carta of socio-economic transformation of a huge number of people in India. The topic of today's lecture is the vision of India in 21st century as envisaged by Dr. Ambedkar. Dr. Ambedkar was clear in his mind that he wanted to see a socio-economic and political transformation in India. He wanted the vast multitude of people of India to enjoy freedom and equality of opportunities. He wanted to rid India of casteism and communalism and bring education and development to every corner of the country. He wanted to India emerge as a modern state where liberty, equality and fraternity flourishes and backwardness is wiped out. Dr. Ambedkar believed in radical change, but he did not want this change to happen through bloodshed. He wanted transformation through parliamentary democracy and rule of law. Dr. Ambedkar saw great potential in using the Constitution as a powerful instrument of socio-economic transformation, and with this intention introduced into draft Constitution a variety of provisions which would enable full accountability of the government, checks and balance, protection of fundamental rights, independent institutions, and consistent movement towards social democracy. Dr. Ambedkar's speech in the Constituent Assembly are of great educational value to the students of our Constitution and modern political history. Dr. Ambedkar explained to the Constituent Assembly in a speech introducing the draft Constitution on November 4, 1948, the pros and cons of the parliamentary form of government vis-a-vis presidential system. He also explained why the draft Constitution, in recommending an executive based on parliamentary system, preferred responsibility to stability. Quoting Dr. Ambedkar, it can be stated, both systems of government are of course democratic, and the choice between the two is not very easy. A democratic executive must satisfy two conditions. One, it must be stable executive. Two, it must be responsible executive. Unfortunately, it has not been possible so far to devise a system which can ensure both in equal degree. You can have a system which can give you more stability but less responsibility, or you can have a system which gives you more responsibility but less stability. Under the non-parliamentary system, such as the one that exists in USA, the assessment of the responsibility of executive is periodic. It is done by the electorate. In England, where the parliamentary system prevails, the assessment of responsibility of the executive is both daily. Assessment of the government is done by members of parliament through questions, resolutions, various motions, including adjournment motions and no confidence motion, and debates on various government policies. Periodic assessment is done by the electorate at the time of the election, which may take place every 5 years or earlier. The daily assessment responsibility, which system is felt far more effective than the periodic assessment and far more necessary in a country like India. Therefore, the draft Constitution, in recommending the parliamentary system of executive, has preferred more responsibility to more stability. The quotations which I have given, I have also given the date of the Constituent Assembly debate and the volume, but I am not mentioning it to save the time. And when the printed copy will be available to you, you will get those references, so any student can verify and find out if there be any error. Dr. Ambedkar described how the President under the Constitution of India cannot be the real executive. He will have to be the ceremonial head of the states. I quote, "He is the head of the state, but not of the executive. He represents the nation, but does not rule the nation. He is the symbol of nation, His place in the administration is that of a ceremonial device on a seal by which the nation's decisions are made known. The President of the Indian Union will be generally bound by the advice of his ministers. He can do nothing contrary to their advice, nor can he do anything without their advice. Commenting on the unique nature of the federation proposed in the draft constitution, Dr. Ambedkar explained why a federal form of government tailored to suit the exigencies of the Indian situation was the need of the hour. Because it was highly debated in those days, and still it is there, whether Indian constitution is federal or what was described at that point of time and is prevalent by a large number of people. It is federal in structure but unitary in bias. Dr. Ambedkar observes, federal constitution in as much as it establishes what may be called by a dual polity. The dual polity under the proposed constitution will consist of the union of the center and the states at the periphery, each endowed with the sovereign powers to be exercised in the field assigned to them respectively by the constitution. The draft constitution can be both unitary as well as federal according to the requirements of time and circumstances. In normal times, it is framed to work as a federal system, but in times of war, it is so designed as to make it work as though it was a unitary system. Why Indian Union should be described as union of states, not as federation of states? He explained painstakingly, and in the Constituent Assembly he observed, the federation is a union because it is indestructible. Though the country and the people may be divided into different states for convenience of administration, the country is one integral whole. Its people, a single people living under a single imperium, deprived from a single source. Dr. Ambedkar ensured the inclusion of well-defined and comprehensive chapter on fundamental right, which specifically abolished the untouchability, guaranteed equal rights to all citizens, and prohibited discrimination of all kinds in social relations. Dr. Ambedkar believed that protection of minorities and their religion was of paramount importance. Thus, the Constitution grants each person the freedom of faith, religion and worship, and gives the minorities freedom to manage their religious affairs. Dr. Ambedkar justified such protection on the following grounds. I quote, "It is wrong for the majority to deny the existence of minorities. It is equally wrong for the minorities to perpetuate themselves. A solution must be found which will serve a double purpose. It must recognize the existence of the minorities to start with. It must also be such that it will enable majorities and minorities to merge someday into one. The solution proposed by the Constituent Assembly is to be welcomed because it is a solution which serves the twofold purpose." Dr. Ambedkar played a crucial role in laying down the directive principles of the state policy, a unique feature of the Indian Constitution. These principles mandate that the state shall strive to promote the welfare of the people by securing and protecting a just social order. These principles lay the foundation of social democracy in Dr. Ambedkar's words. I quote, "We must make our political democracy a social democracy as well. What does social democracy mean? It means a way of life which recognizes liberty, equality, and fraternity are the principles of life. These principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity are not to be treated as separate items in a trinity. They form a union or trinity in the sense that to divorce one from the other is to defeat the very purpose of democracy. Without equality, liberty would produce the supremacy of a few over the many. Equality without liberty would kill individual initiative. Without fraternity, liberty and equality would not become a natural course of things. It would require a constable to enforce them. On the social plane, we have in India a socially based on the principles of graded inequality, which means elevation of some and degradation of others. On the economic plane, we have a society in which there are some who have immense wealth as against many who live in abject poverty. How long shall we continue to live this life of contradiction? We must remove this contradiction at the earliest and possible moment, or else those who suffer from inequality will blow up the structure of political democracy. Once the directive principles of the state policy were criticized by some as mere wishes, mere as pious declarations. Responding to this criticism, Dr. Ambedkar said, "Whoever captures power will not be free to do what he likes with it. In the exercise of it, he will have to respect those instruments for instructions which are called directive principles. He cannot ignore them. He may not have to answer for their breach in a court of law, but he will certainly have to answer for them before the electorate at election time." Unquote. Dr. Ambedkar was firm in his belief that our judiciary must both be independent of the executive and must also be competent in itself. He did recognize, however, the tussles between the executive and the judiciary were inevitable and were in fact necessary to ensure that each acted as a check and balance on the functioning of the other. He observed, I quote, "For myself, I cannot altogether omit the possibility of a legislature backed by party men making laws which may abrogate or violate what we regard as certain fundamental principles affecting the life and liberty of an individual. At the same time, I do not see how 5 or 6 gentlemen sitting in the federal or Supreme Court examining laws made by the legislature and by dint of their own individual conscience or their bias or their prejudices be trusted to determine which law is good and which law is bad." Unquote. Dr. Ambedkar called upon the socially and economically disadvantaged to agitate and organize. Nevertheless, his commitment to constitutional methods was unwavering, and he advocated a path of informed and reasoned public engagement. He used to say, "We must abandon the bloody methods of revolution. When there was no way left for constitutional methods for achieving economic and social objectives, there was a great deal of justification for unconstitutional methods. But where constitutional methods are open, there can be no justification for these unconstitutional methods. These methods are nothing but the grammar of anarchy, and sooner they are abandoned, the better for us. Dr. Ambedkar believed that strong independent institutions constituted the fundamental pillars of democracy, and it is they who would ensure its survival. He ensured that Constitution provides for an independent judiciary, and the right to constitutional remedies become a fundamental right. Speaking about Article 32, the right of the constitutional remedies, Dr. Ambedkar said, I quote, "If I was asked to name any particular article in the Constitution as the most important, an article without which the Constitution would be a nullity, I could not refer to any other article except this one, that is Article 32. It is very soul of the Constitution and the heart of it." Dr. Ambedkar called for the Independent Election Commission and instituted the same through Article 324 of the Constitution. In his words, "The greatest safeguard for purity of the elections, for fairness in elections, was to take away the matter from the hands of the executive authority and to hand it over some independent authority." It must be mentioned in this regard that Election Commission of India has since gone on to win widespread praise and appreciation within the country and across the world. Our very first Chief Election Commissioner, Sri Sukumar Sen, was invited to supervise the elections in Sudan, and since then the services and expertise of India's Election Commission has been sought by many countries. We have also just witnessed the efficiency and independence with which the elections to the 16th Lok Sabha was recently held, despite the enormous diversity of our nation and an electoral size of around 834 million electors. The Election Commission was a single-member commission till October 1989, when two additional commissioners were appointed for the first time, making it a multi-member commission. Similarly, on the office of the Auditor General, popularly known as CAG, Comptroller and Auditor General, he observed, "I am of opinion this dignitary or officer is probably the most important officer in the Constitution of India. He is the one man who is going to see that the expenses voted by Parliament are not exceeded or varied from what has been laid down by Parliament in what is called the appropriation. If this function is to carry out the duties, and his duties, I submit, are far more important than the duties even of the judiciary, I personally feel that he ought to have far greater independence than the judiciary itself." Unquote. Dr. Ambedkar was clear that no constitution is perfect, and ultimately the working of the Constitution will depend upon the people, political parties, and their policies. He stated emphatically about the Constitution, I quote, "It is workable, it is flexible, and it is strong enough to hold the country together, both in peacetime and in war. Indeed, I may say so, if things go wrong under the new constitution, the reason will not be that we had a bad constitution. What we will have to say is that man is vile, unquote. It must be noted in the above regard that in practice our political system has innovative and flexible. Dr. Ambedkar's commitment to the building of the strong institutions and constitutional methods has resulted in many interesting modern day manifestations. For example, the Right to Information Act is a unique and powerful instrument created by law to empower people, to enable them access information from any department of the government on any subject, advancing thereby openness and transparency. Similarly, the Supreme Court of India, through public interest litigation, has enabled the common man access to the highest courts of justice by just sending a postcard. High courts and Supreme Courts have always taken suo motu cognizance of violation of fundamental rights and initiated action on their own, setting aside the conventional notions of locus standi. Finally, we witnessed very recently the phenomenon of a popular agitation led by Sri Anna Hazare, resulting in civil society gaining direct voice in the legislative process, hitherto reserved only for the elected members of Parliament and state legislature. A draft Lokpal bill was finalized through the consultations between representatives of the civil society, senior members of the government, prior to its presentation in the Parliament and subsequent adoption as law. All these above reflect the strength of Indian democracy and the dynamism of the Constitution, whose architect was Dr. Ambedkar. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, India's journey since independence has seen many successes. The greatest challenge for our founding fathers was to come up with a viable system of government. We have in the last 67 years established a successful parliamentary democracy, an independent judiciary, strong institutions like Election Commission, Comptroller and Auditor General to sustain and support our political system. The biggest and the most complex issue that independent India had to address was the issue of the political, social and economic exclusion of a significant segment of our population. A unique and comprehensive policy of affirmative action was adopted through the Constitution to empower members of the communities which were socially excluded and to bring them into the national mainstream. India is today recognized across the world for our democratic and secular values, as well as establishing an inclusive and modern social order. On the economic front, we have made many significant gains, taking a substantial segment of our people from the poverty line, from the below poverty line to above poverty line, and to a level of the dignified existence. We shall have to keep in mind that entire first half of the last century, from 1901 to 1950, Indian economy grew at an average rate of only 1%. India was a perpetual importer of the food grains. And from that stage, today Parliament, public, media debate why the Indian economy is not growing 7 to 8%, why it has slipped to 5% or 5.5%. But full 50 years it was just 1%. Therefore, after independence we have achieved it. As per purchasing power parity, Indian economy today is the third largest powerful economy of the world. And even during the crisis of 2008 onwards, one of the very few economies which helped to sustain a world output at a particular level included first China and then India. There is no doubt that still there is a large number of people live below poverty line. But it is equally true that the poverty ratio has come down from 60% in 1950s to less than 30% in 2010. It is equally true that the country which produced just 50 million grains in 1951 today are producing 260 million tons of food grains, and not importing food grains but exporting. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is a reality, however, that despite all the achievements in which we can take legitimate pride, our democracy continues to face many challenges. Large number of Indians still live in poverty, deprivation and want. Consistent casteism, too sadly, remains a phenomenon we are yet to wipe out from our country and society. Dr. Ambedkar's dream of an India in which all sections of society are empowered socially, economically and politically, an India in which every section of our population believes that they have an equal stake in the country and its future, and an India in which social status will be decided not by standing in the caste hierarchy or economic wealth, but by individual merit. Dr. Ambedkar's vision was of an India where the social system and economy would permit the full development of human potential and ensure a dignified existence for all our citizenry. Each one of us has a responsibility to do our utmost to make Dr. Ambedkar's dreams come true. We must do everything possible to preserve and strengthen our democracy. We must engage in combined and committed efforts to overcome poverty and prejudice. We need to be constantly on the guard against divisive forces raising their heads in the country. We should address with utmost speed the challenges of malnutrition, ignorance, unemployment and infrastructure. We must also ensure that untouchability or any form of disability based on caste, creed, religion or sex is not practiced in any part of the country. It is only through these endeavors can we occupy our rightful place in the leading ranks of the Committee of Nations. Dr. Ambedkar's message, work and life are a constant reminder of the outstanding constitution, strong democracy, effective independent institutions we have inherited from the founding fathers of our nation. At the same time, it also reminds us the distance we shall need to travel in building an egalitarian society where there will be no distinction between man and man. Let me conclude recalling Dr. Ambedkar's words from his address in the Constituent Assembly on November 25, 1949, and after that there was no session of Constituent Assembly. The same body transferred itself into Provisional Parliament and continued up to next election in 1952. I quote, "In addition to our old enemies in the form of castes and creeds, we are going to have many political parties with diverse and opposing political creeds. Will Indians place the country above their creed, or will they place creed above country? I do not know. But this much is certain, that if the parties place creed above country, our independence will be put in jeopardy and a second time, and probably be lost forever. The eventuality we must all resolutely guard against. We must be determined to defend our independence with the last drop of our blood." Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Jai Hind.